Sa discussion na 'to, pag-uusapan natin yung low-level versus high-level programming. So, ang iko-cover natin is ano yung low-level and high-level programming, ano yung mga differences nila, and then yung advantages and or disadvantages of both. Importante kasi na i-discuss na merong something called low-level programming and high-level programming. So, ano ngayon yung pagkakaiba nilang dalawa? So, discuss muna natin yung pinaka-basic na pagkakaiba. Yung sa low-level programming, very granular siya. Mas detalyado siya or pwede rin natin sabihin na kumbaga parang mas himay-himay siya. Dahil nga sa low level siya kapag tayo ay nagra-write ng instructions. Yung low level programming kasi is it's more closer dun sa how a computer would do it. Hindi man siya eksakto pero it's close. Ngayon kung narinig nyo na yung assembly, yun yung ginagamit sa low-level programming. A good way to look at it is yung kung paano gumagalaw yung mga robot. Okay? So, hindi siya katulad nung sa mga modern movies. Yung mga ano lang, more basic ones lang. 'Di ba nga ginagaya pa natin sila through yung parang robotic dance. So, kapag dinescribe natin sila, yung bawat movie is very mechanical. In the case of a humanoid robot, kasama doon yung paggalaw ng braso, yung paa, and then yung mga joints, di ba? Sa low-level programming kasi, it's like trying to instruct a robot para gawin yung bawat movement na yon. Sa high-level programming naman, you're writing the instructions in a way na mas malapit dun sa way kung paano tayo mag-isip as humans. Basically, sinasabi natin sa computer kung ano yung gagawin niya in a way na mas natural sa atin. Yung language na ginagamit is less mechanical compared to low-level programming. Some examples of high-level programming languages is Java, Python, Ruby, and JavaScript. Gamit ulit yung ating robot analogy, instead of trying to instruct yung robot para dun sa movement ng bawat part ng katawan niya, sa high-level programming language, it's possible na pwede mo lang sabihin na move one step forward, make a full turn, diba? Yung 360-degree na turn, jump as high as you can, yung pinaka-maximum na kaya mo. Ganun lang siya. Parang ganun yung idea. Ngayon, yung pagkakaiba na to is important kasi it makes us a lot more productive. So, mas marami tayong nagagawa with less work. Pero yung mas importante doon is we can also make it a lot more easier or mas natural para sa atin na i-express kung ano yung gusto natin mangyari. So let's break down yung difference nila. In general, yung low-level programming is yung type ng programming that's closer to the computer hardware. Okay? So when we say closer to the computer hardware, you get to deal with yung mga specifics or yung details kung paano gumagana yung computer hardware. So, mas matrabaho to. Doon naman sa high-level programming is siya yung type ng programming na closer dun sa human user. Since high-level siya, you don't get to deal with yung specifics kung paano gumagana yung computer hardware. Instead, those are abstracted away or natatago na siya sa'yo. Magagamit mo yung typical human logic. So, ano yung mga to? Let's go through some examples. So, one example would be decisions. And this translates to something called conditionals sa programming. So, pwede natin sabihin na kapag ganito yung scenario, do this, otherwise, do this instead. So, paano natin i-implement to? So, pwede natin sabihin na kung yung signal is color green, go. If it's red, then stop. So another one is repetition. And sa programming, meron tayong tinatawag na loops. Okay, so ito yung equivalent ng loops. Basically, pwede natin sabihin na do this repeatedly across ng lahat ng items. So again, paano natin i-implement to? For example, Sa lahat ng ating shapes, color it red. Diba? So, mangyayari bawat shape dun sa group ng lahat ng shapes is magiging kulay red. Now, pwede rin natin sila i-combine. So, let's say, sa lahat ng shapes, kung yung shape is circle, kukulayan natin siya ng red. And then everything else, kukulayan natin siya ng blue. Ngayon, para mas magkaroon tayo ng idea kung paano yung pagkakaiba when working with low-level and high-level programming languages, let's dive more into yung factors that sets them apart. So, mainly that would be abstraction, and then yung more human-like language or more natural. Diba? So, pag-usapan natin itong mga factors na to. As a simple example, let's take the steps for, let's say, breakfast. Diba? So, for breakfast, meron tayong step na cook breakfast and then eat breakfast. So, kung papansin ninyo, this is more high level, diba? Mas high level tong version na to. Now, ano kaya maging itsura nito pagka ginawa natin ng low level version? Let's take a look at an example. Okay, so ito yung pinaka first step, 'di ba? Cook breakfast. So in this case, step 1, turn on the stove. Step 2, put the pan on the stove. Step 3, pour oil in the pan. Step 4, wait for the pan to become hot. Step 5, get 4 eggs from the fridge. Step 6, cook each of the 4 eggs in the pan, sunny side up. Step 7, place the 4 eggs in a large plate. Okay, next, ito yung eat breakfast. So, step 1, set the table for breakfast. Step 2, sit on the chair. Step 3, slice the eggs 2 pieces. Step 4, eat eggs. Step 5, drink some water. Step 6, repeat 5 and 6 until finished. Ngayon, kung makikita nyo, yung low-level version is mas detalyado. In fact, mas sobrang detalyado siya, di ba? So, low-level programming takes a lot more work than high-level programming. Whereas sa high-level programming naman, we take yung most of the tedious work, okay, yung maraming steps, we take that away by being able to express in a more abstracted approach. So, meaning yung details are now hidden. Ngayon, kahit ganon, yung low-level programming is still well-suited for scenarios kung saan kailangan mo i-specify kung ano yung eksaktong gusto mong mangyari hanggang dun sa pinakamaliliit na details, di ba? So, it gets considered kung gusto mo ng super small, precise, and extremely fast code. So, imagine very small programs, very precise, ibig sabihin kung ano lang exacto yung gusto mong mangyari, and sobrang bilis. Ngayon, pagdating naman dun sa factor ng more human-like na language or mas natural, magbibigay ako ng analogy related to high level being more natural. Okay? So, hindi siya eksaktong comparison, pero ang point ko lang dito is makapagbigay ng idea kung bakit nakakatulong yung pagkakaroon ng high level programming language. Okay, so ito yung situation. So, you're a Filipino. So, nakakapagsalita ka ng Tagalog. Marunong ka rin mag-English. But sometimes, may mga situation na kung baga, mas madali i-express yung Tagalog. So, take note, this is English versus Tagalog. Meron kasi mga ideas na talagang mas madali lang i-explain sa Tagalog. And most likely, kaya mo siya explain sa English. But it's just a lot easier to express it sa sarili mong language. So ngayon, magde-decide ka na just to keep explaining using yung Tagalog, di ba? Yung sarili mong language. Kasi it only makes sense na kung gagawin mo siya regularly, mas may ginagawin mo na lang siya mas madali sa'yo, di ba? Make your job easier, kumbaga. One important distinction between low-level programming and high-level programming is how it relates to processor architecture. Okay, so importante to. A low-level programming language is specific to a processor architecture or CPU. Kung hindi ka familiar sa term na to, it's okay. But to give you an idea, yung mga processor na ginagamit sa smartphones natin ay iba dun sa mga ginagamit sa laptop or desktop computers. So kung narinig nyo na yung terms na x86 o kaya ARM, yun yung mga processors with different architectures. So ito yung reason kung bakit low-level programming is very specific work. Hindi mo talaga siya gagawin unless kailangan talaga or nandun ka sa ganong klaseng type of job role. Sa high-level programming language naman, independent siya of yung processor architecture. If you're using a high-level programming language, you don't really care much about of yung processor architecture kung saan tatakbo yung code mo. Mas focus ka dun sa kung paano dapat gumana yung software mo rather than paano gagana yung software mo on computer hardware. However, gusto ko lang i-note na meron kasi mga instances na merong advantage to knowing how the hardware works kapag nagko-code ka in high-level programming languages. So, magagamit yan in terms of, let's say, optimization or performance. Pero in most cases, hindi to isa sa mga una mong ma-encounter. Ngayon, since high-level programming is hindi siya tied to a specific processor architecture, ang ibig sabihin nito, another advantage of using high-level programming languages is you now get to have more portability. Ibig sabihin, yung code mo can be made to work across different kinds of processors. Again, gusto ko lang i-note na yung portability of high-level programming languages doesn't mean gagana lang siya agad-agad on any computer. Okay? So, portability kasi has different levels and factors to consider. So, different processor architectures, different OS, operating systems, diba? For high-level programming languages kasi, there still needs to be a compilation process or in some languages, there's something called an interpreter para gumana yung code. Yung ibang programming languages even has yung tinatawag na virtual machine or VM para gumana siya aside from yung compilation. So yung VM is just like a mediator between a running program and the OS. The OS being the one that's managing the access dun sa hardware. Okay, so these are just common examples kung paano tatakbo yung code mo across different computers. Yon, so okay, ang dami nang natin na-discuss. Pero may mga ilan pa tayong i-cover before we wrap up. So I hope okay pa. And gusto ko lang din i-point out na yung mga discussions na to about programming, I'll be mostly referring to high-level programming languages unless I mention specifically that I'm talking about low-level programming. So the final thing that I want to discuss is that yung low-level versus high-level programming languages can also be relative. Sinasabi ko to because even within yung high-level programming languages, meron pa rin yung kino-consider natin na low-level dun sa category na yon. I mentioned some examples of high-level programming languages earlier like Java, Python, Ruby, and JavaScript. Another programming language is C, which is dun binase yung marami sa mga major programming languages natin today. Lumabas kasi yung C noong mga 1970s and during those times, yung C was considered a high-level programming language. However, compared to dun sa mga mas bagong high-level programming language today, lumalabas C is more low-level kasi it requires more work. So, for example, sa C programming, you get to deal a lot with yung managing computer memory. In newer programming languages, managing computer memory is mostly ginagawa na para sa'yo automatically. One could argue that yung C programming today is like low-level programming. Ngayon yung C programming is indeed more low-level than Python programming or Ruby programming, pero yung C programming is still high-level compared to assembly programming. Alright, so that's it para sa ating discussion. I hope you learned something and don't forget, keep learning.